The tariffs, they're on hold and they're not on hold. So the reciprocal tariffs are now on hold for 90 days. If you are a listener of this program, if you subscribe to my show notes, let me reset the stage for you. So I got woken up before, 6 a.m. on Monday, and so I could update my show notes before they went out to everybody around 6:30 a.m. And I was told specifically by a very well-placed source inside Trump land, inside the White House, I guess I could say, that the president was going to put a hold on the tariffs, would say essentially that there were so many countries that wanted deals, he was going to put them on hold. But the actual reason was because the investors, whose major donors were all in a frenzy this weekend, particularly at Mar-a-Lago, very unhappy with the markets. Now, the president's team, including the Treasury Secretary, came out late yesterday when the president put everything on pause and said this had always been part of the plan. And you had people across the country, Trump supporters, saying this was just the art of the deal. You should read the art of the deal. For the president's part, the president himself said he was putting the tariffs on hold because the bond market was getting, in his words, yippy and needed to slow things down. That's the president's words, not my words. Whether it's the art of the deal or not, the reciprocal tariffs are on pause. Now, here's the catch, though. Yesterday, the stock market soared. In fact, it was the largest one-day gain in the stock market in history, I believe. It is now cratering. All the gains yesterday are being given up today. The Dow is actually down pretty significantly, 1,635 points. NASDAQ down 962. The S&P 500 down 259. Now, what did I tell you? Before the end of the show yesterday, I told you that I thought that people were misreading what the president's tweet actually meant, and people assumed all the tariffs were gone away. Actually, what happened was the 10% tariffs stay, and the what do you call them? The sector tariffs stay. So what does that mean? The 25% auto tariff still in effect, and the pharmaceutical tariff will go into effect. All the other tariffs are at 10% now. There are no massive reciprocal tariffs now. So that being said, it's a very big deal and a good thing that the reciprocal tariffs are paused, and it did give the market a jolt yesterday until they realized actually it's the regular tariffs are here. That being said, there is a problem for the Trump administration in pausing the reciprocal tariffs and keeping the baseline tariff. And you need to understand this just so you're smarter than all your friends when this sort of thing comes up. The president is using authority under legislation about emergency powers. And it's hard to say blanket 10% tariffs that there's an emergency need for. When the legislation talks about targeting specific countries, imposing a broad 10% tariff actually probably could, well, that could undermine his case. You just you do need to understand that particular part here, that the legislative power comes from an emergency law that Congress passed regarding specific emergencies around the world and allowing presidents to impose specific and limited, that's the key language, specific and limited tariffs to respond to the emergency. And by the way, a lawsuit has now been filed against the tariffs, and one of the key arguments is that specific and limited tariffs are not a blanket, broad-based 10% tariff. And by getting rid of the reciprocal tariffs and making it 10% against everyone, including countries that actually have a zero tariffs against us, and we have free trade agreements with, that could undermine the president's argument. Now, I have been told today that they are aware of this and that they do understand, and some of them inside the White House, you would come to believe they might know that this could undermine the tariffs, but then you could blame the judges again. Now, that being said, there is some breaking news that's happening as I'm on air talking to you right now. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has just issued a decision in the last few minutes, and I see the headline here. I haven't had time to digest the decision, but the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has actually blocked a lower court decision that would have told Donald Trump that he had to fund DEI grants. Now, the Supreme Court has stayed something on this, and now the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, in just the last couple of minutes since I've been talking, has now also issued this order saying that the President of the United States does not have to fund DEI grants. This is yet another win for the Trump administration. So now keep this in mind for perspective. The President is now 7 out of 8 wins in the Supreme Court. He's now something like 5 out of 6 wins in courts of appeals. And the tariff lawsuit has just been filed. My suspicion is y'all know I don't like tariffs, and I'm trying to actually be as objective as I can on this, which you can say is hard or impossible, whatever. I realize the age we live in. But I do think, and based on this conversation I had with some of the same people who have been keeping me clued in on what's going on, I actually think there are people inside the White House setting the president up to fail on tariffs. Let me explain. A lot of the behind-the-scenes people in the White House and the Treasury Department and the economic team have long been opposed to tariffs. Peter Navarro loves them. Howard Lutnick loves them. Most of the rest of the economic team opposes them. The legal basis for filing the tariffs has been this emergency law that allows limited and specific tariffs to combat particular egregious behavior by global trading partners. The reciprocal tariffs, whether I agreed with the calculations or not, the reciprocal tariffs addressed those emergency situations. They were limited and specific country by country, designed to punish countries for trading violations. A broad-based 10% tariff, along with sector tariffs related to automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and other materials. And now apparently the president just a few minutes ago, or actually a couple hours ago, said he may give specific companies in the United States exemptions from all the tariffs. Those most hard hit, Apple Computer, might actually get a complete exemption from the tariffs, including possibly the Chinese tariffs. If that's the case, these aren't specific and limited. And so my suspicion is at this point, and again, this is my informed speculation based on conversations with firsthand sources inside the mix and inside the conversation, based on my knowledge of the law, based on the way the statute reads, and based on how it's being applied. I'm wondering if there are people inside the White House who are pushing the president towards decisions that actually undermine the tariffs overall and provide ammunition for a lower court to say, you know what, this isn't legal. So the president himself can look like he's tough on trade, and it could be those liberals in the judiciary who have blocked him. That is, again, speculation on my part, but I'm having conversation with these people who are inside the White House who are deeply skeptical of tariffs and actually believe it's going to cause economic harm. And they understand that the president is listening to Peter Navarro and Howard Lutnick, and the president himself is a longtime proponent of tariffs and also doesn't like trade deficits. And so they're trying to steer a path where the president gets what he wants, but is also protected from what they believe are the ramifications of tariffs. That all leads me to this court case that has now been filed. And by the way, it's not actually progressives who have filed the case. It's some conservatives who have filed the case against the tariffs. Just understand this is the lay of the land. And so also, this is why the words from the White House matter. The confusions over how they came up with the reciprocal tariff formula matter, although it's kind of moot now that they put it on pause for 90 days. The words from the president himself that this wasn't actually some large-scale negotiating plan. It was because the bond market got yippy and his investors complained over the weekend about the effects on the stock market. Those sorts of things matter in building the record that will be used against the administration. So they got to be very, very careful. All of that being said, I think the president could go higher on tariffs in China. and I kind of think he should. I think we need to stop treating China as some sort of trading partner or rival. China is the enemy. But that being said, I think there's another reason here the president can also now fully enforce the ban on TikTok. Some of the people who are the loudest critics of the tariffs behind the scenes are some of the conservatives who invested in TikTok and in ByteDance. You're now giving them what they want, Mr. President, on the tariffs, the pause that they wanted. There's no reason to give them TikTok now. If we really are in a major power struggle with China right now. By the way, the Chinese embassy put out a tweet of a Mao speech saying that they never back down. Mao, of course, backed down pretty soon after giving that speech. If the Chinese have decided to escalate this, and it appears they have, and we're going back and forth escalating the tariffs on China, get rid of TikTok. The Chinese are brainwashing our youth through TikTok. If we have such a national security threat against China that you can deploy strategic tariffs against China, it's probably time to deploy the strategic tariffs. And it's time to deploy the ban on TikTok to undermine China. That's just, listen, I think either China is a threat or it's not. And if it is a threat, and I think it is a threat, it's not some sort of economic rival. It's not some sort of major trading partner. It's actually the enemy. So treat it like the enemy. I think that also means it's time for this administration to consider something that the prior administration rejected out of hand, and that is it time to deport Chinese national students who are inside the United States getting their engineering and technical education? I know, bold move there, Erickson, I realize. But I'm kind of thinking that we might need to start evicting Chinese national students who are inside American universities. By the way, but everybody knows it, and it's very common to talk about it within national security circles. A lot of them are actually agents of the Chinese government. They're not just here getting education, they're here spying. They're trying to recruit professors. They're trying to recruit other students. It's probably time to get rid of these students. Now, I know there are a lot of people who don't want to say something like that. But if we're evicting the illegal aliens, shouldn't we be evicting the Chicoms? I think it's probably time to do that. So enforce the ban on TikTok. You've already got the legislative authority to do it. Oust the Chinese national spies who are in our academy. And be careful with your words on the baseline 10% tariffs, because the markets today, as I told you what happened yesterday, when they realized that the 10% tariffs of the sector tariffs were still there, the market was probably going to tank again today. Yes, the market is tanking. There are other reasons, too, why it's tanking. I'll get to those when we come back. But Mr. President, if this is a national security issue, treat the Chinese like the enemy and start ousting their students and banning their apps and increase the tariffs even more. I'm totally fine with tariffs. Some good news out there today economically, and that is inflation has not only fallen, it actually, month-over-month CPI inflation turned negative. That is, it's now, if it stays negative, that becomes a depression. It's a bad thing. Nobody actually thinks that's going to happen. But it actually dipped significantly, fell below 3% for the first time since March of 2021. CPI did. Total inflation at 2.4%, lower than expected, 2.5%. Now, that should be an encouraging sign to the markets. So why are the markets plunging? You should know right now the S&P 500 has fallen so much that it is almost at the breaker limit where they pause trading. It's got 1% more to fall, and no idea if it'll actually do that, but it is fallen 336 points now as it updates. It could cause the circuit breakers within the S&P to hit and pause trading. We haven't seen that happen, I think, since COVID. So why is everything, you got this great inflation number, so why? Why is this happening? It's because of commodity prices. Let me just explain this to you. So, commodities, many of which on the futures markets, oil and other things are cratering. The price of commodities are collapsing. That's twofold. Some commodities are collapsing because other countries are dropping our agricultural products in favor of other countries' agricultural products. The other issue is that this is kind of a common harbinger of recession. When all the commodity prices start collapsing, and again, I'm not an expert, but I do know how to listen to the experts and read books. When all the commodity prices, particularly the energy commodities, start collapsing, that is read as a sign of a recession. And the Moody's, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, others are coming out saying this is a really bad warning sign that the commodities are starting to all go down together, given it tends to typically historically be a harbinger of recession coming. So that's why the markets are doing what they're doing. That and the tariffs are actually still there. I wanted to begin my show today on the budget situation, but given all the news overnight on tariffs, I thought it was probably best to reset the situation just so you understand what's in effect, what's not in effect, the legal arguments that are about to be made in a courtroom over the tariffs. But the budget actually has a lot of implications here, too. The House last night tried to pass the Senate budget framework. Now, there are two arguments here you need to understand. The one argument, and that is the argument a lot of people in the Senate make, and the establishmentarians make, and that is that the budget resolution is actually meaningless. The budget resolution does nothing. All the budget resolution does is set the framework for future debate. So there's never a reason to vote against the budget resolution because it's non-binding, doesn't actually set the budget, and you can change it later. It just begins. It's the starting point for the negotiations. It's not the ending point. Conservatives, however, tend to argue, and I am in this camp, that if it is the starting point for negotiations, then you gotta set a high bar for spending, because we're headed towards a fiscal crisis, and that fiscal crisis is going to mean a massive increase in taxes for the American family, including the middle class, a massive cut in government services, and it will, and you need to understand this, it will force cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. It absolutely will if we hit this fiscal crisis. I had someone the other day who clearly wasn't thinking, didn't understand the situation, whatnot, and was attacking me, saying, no. There are not going to be any cuts to Social Security. There will be no cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. Why are you needlessly saying that they're in jeopardy and they're going to go bankrupt? This is why. Because if we hit a fiscal crisis, and we are on the verge, what is the number one thing that must be covered by the government? It is the one payment the government of the United States is not allowed to get out of under the law: debt service. Debt service. So if interest on the national debt is super high, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid definitionally have to be cut. They have to be cut because debt service has to be paid. The United States guarantees full faith and credit of the United States when it comes to our debt. You cannot get out of the debt payment. Now, you can say, well, Erickson, are we owed money under Social Security? Social Security is not a lockbox. The money for Social Security goes into the general fund. It doesn't go into a segregated fund. It goes into the general fund. And you are not owed that money back by the government. It is actually treated as taxation by the courts, and you don't get your taxes back. You're lucky you get some Social Security back, but it's not a guarantee. What is guaranteed is that the nation has to pay its debts. So if the national debt gets too high and the debt payments get too high, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid payments will be cut to fund the debt, and we don't want that to happen. I'm not saying we want it to happen. I'm not encouraging it. I'm just telling you that's the reality of the situation. Debt service payment comes before everything else, and everything else is expendable to debt service. Now, what happens if you have to fund 100% of the money into the federal government to pay debt service? Guess what? Well, then your taxes go up to get the rest. Your taxes go up to make everything happen, to make everything balance, to make everything work. And we don't want that either, because that will really cause economic harm in the country. We've seen other countries go through this. It's not a good thing, and rarely do you come out on the other side in a good position. So you got to be real careful. So the conservatives refused. There were about 12 to 15 of them last night. They refused to go along with the Senate budget resolution. Now, remember, again, the establishment says it doesn't matter. It's just the starting point of negotiations. What the conservatives say is that if it's the starting point for negotiations and it's not cutting anything, then anything that they negotiate moving forward is not going to be high enough, and we need strong cuts to government. So led by Thomas Massie, Chip Roy, Andy Harris, and the House Freedom Caucus, they killed off the budget resolution last night. They didn't vote it down. It got pulled from the floor. They canceled the vote. They canceled the vote, hoping to bring the vote back today. They are working very hard on pulling as many as possible of those 12 to 15 members and getting them to a yes. It does not appear at this moment that they have gotten all of the yes votes that they need. I hope that they'll be able to get more cuts. So Chip Roy is kind of the probably the smartest member of the House of Representatives, and now I'm biased. He's a longtime friend, but he actually is very smart. And Chip Roy, what you have to understand, does not care if he loses his reelection. He is convinced we're at the point in this country where if we don't start cutting big, we're going to have serious problems. And because we're going to have serious problems, we need to take action now. What Roy is essentially saying is if the Senate will come over and actually commit to the House's initial offer, the House initially said $1.5 trillion in cuts. Where's the Senate? The Senate's at like $400 billion in cuts. They'll agree to $400 billion in spending cuts. The House's plan was $1.5 trillion. What Roy is saying, if you start at $1.5 trillion in cuts, I'm open to pretty much anything. Now, side note, there's an additional negotiation you need to know about going on here, and that's over something called the REINS Act. Kat Cammack is a congresswoman from Florida. Kat Cammack has got the conservatives in the House and the Senate bought in on the REINS Act. Now, this is something that's also happening at the state level. This is very, very wonky. But you got to understand that this is a negotiated leverage from the conservatives. They want the REINS Act. If they can find a way to get it in the past the Byrd rule, and they think they found a way, they want the REINS Act. What is the REINS Act? The REINS Act would rein in the government bureaucracy. Essentially, what the REINS Act says is that if a regulator intends to pass a regulation that would cost Americans or American businesses, I want to say like $100 million over a 10-year period, Congress has to legislate it. Now, there are state-level versions of the REINS Act as well, and some of the states are $1 million, $10 million. Utah, for example, Utah just passed the REINS Act. In Georgia, it got killed off of the legislative session, but a number of states, I think Texas is looking at the REINS Act. And essentially what happens is legislative bodies at the state and the federal government level, they outsource a lot of their legislative capacity to regulators, and regulators, because they're unelected, they don't have to care about the costs that Congress does. So what the REINS Act does is it says you regulators cannot pass regulations if those regulations are assessed to cost X number of dollars. Now, there are formulas that the government uses to assess the cost, and they've contemplated those, so it makes it harder for the regulators to rig the numbers. A number of the conservatives want the REINS Act passed. I want the REINS Act passed. The REINS Act is solid legislation that would rein in the federal bureaucracy and keep the federal bureaucracy from harm. Take, for example, the regulations on tankless water heaters. The Trump administration is rolling those back. The Biden administration, tankless water heater regulation would have not only wiped out an industry, literally would have wiped out an industry, it would have also cost the industry hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of compliance. What the REINS Act would do if it's put into reconciliation is say, You can't pass that as a regulator. You have to send the regulation as proposed to Congress, and Congress has to pass it, and the president has to sign it into law. It would actively deter onerous regulations from the bureaucracy. And what conservatives are essentially saying is, I'm willing to compromise if you give us the REINS Act. And if you don't give us the REINS Act, you have to cut trillions of dollars in spending. But we have to do something to rein in the power of Washington, and we have to do something to rein in the spending in Washington. And the REINS Act would accomplish part of that with the power. Spending cuts would accomplish the other. I mean, we're kind of in this wild, wild space right now where Donald Trump's major supporters care greatly about the cost of government and spending, and yet the president was convinced by the Senate that he needed to sign on to their budget resolution, but their budget resolution doesn't cut the spending that the president and his base care about. And I do honestly sometimes wonder, the president is busy. He's doing a lot of things at once. Is he being given candid advice from his advisors on the spending issue? Because the president cares about the spending. The president has repeatedly said he wants to cut government. And you know what the Senate plan doesn't even do is it doesn't even rescind the stuff that DOJ found. That's kind of the most offensive part of this. The president and Elon Musk have made a big deal of exposing waste, fraud, and abuse in government. The Senate and the House could rescind it. And by the way, a rescission package bypasses the filibuster. So the Democrats couldn't filibuster. They could rein it all back in. But the Senate didn't even do that. These are the things the president has said he's wanted. And I'm kind of flummoxed on who isn't telling the president the parameters of the legislation. I know he's got a lot of stuff going on, the tariffs and everything else, but this is kind of a big deal. It is his legacy. The tax package is his ultimate legacy. So I'm flummoxed by it. All that being said, the House today is trying to get the votes of enough conservatives to at least get a budget resolution passed. John Thune has come out and said they will cooperate with the House on finding greater cuts. The problem is the Senate's not willing to put it in writing. If they're not willing to title the Senate that it is actually willing to find the cuts. But right now, the president can't get his tax cut package passed without the budget resolution so that we can even begin negotiations. And they can't get the budget resolution passed because the Senate is not willing to, in writing, commit to cutting government the way they say they're willing to do it. If they say they're that committed to doing it, they should be willing to put it in writing. And that they're not speaks volumes to me. I stand with the House conservatives on this. It's a bad deal unless the Senate's willing to put in writing. They really will cut the size and scope of the federal government. Every time I start getting attacked by Trump supporters pretty aggressively online comes at a time where they themselves feel the least secure. Now, you can deny it. You can say that's not true. But in my experience, going back to 2015, if they feel encouraged and they feel like they're on the right side, if they feel like things are in their direction, I never hear from a lot of Trump supporters that I need to toe a party line or affirm their beliefs or quote unquote get on the Trump train. But when the headwinds start building and they start feeling like everyone is out to get them and they're on defense and things are going well, that is when I hear constantly get on the Trump train or get off the radio, shut up, you have Trump derangement syndrome, whatever. That's when I hear the you've got Trump derangement syndrome. Never mind, I supported him in 2020 and 2024. In fact, the guy who told me last night I had Trump derangement syndrome, I needed to get on the Trump train or get off the radio, pulled up his voter file versus mine. I've given Donald Trump more money than he has. But when the headwinds build, they get a little defensive and they tell you get on the Trump train or else. The left, however, is losing their mind too. Do you know yesterday we had the big spike in the stock market? Donald Trump tweeted out, now's a great time to buy. People took him at his word. People started buying. The stock market shot up, and you know what the left is saying today? I bet he engaged in insider trading. I bet Donald Trump tipped people off. He did tip people off online. I saw it. I saw the tweet. I didn't buy. I already bought my Apple stock the other day. It did quite well yesterday. Apple rebounded. It's all back down again today, but that's okay. You know what actually caused the massive stock market spike yesterday? When the market started going up because of Trump's tweet about suspending the tariffs, hedge funds realized they would be out so much money because they were betting on the stock market collapse. They started having to buy up stuff so that they wouldn't get out over their skis, and that caused the market to go up even higher. There's a big story in the CNBC today about why the stock market at the end of the day had this massive spike. It was because hedge funds had hedged their bets on a further market decline and got spooked that, maybe the stock market's going to start going up again. And they caused a massive spike in the market that is now selling off today. But the left saw it and they're like, there must be something sinister here. Where people on the right are, it's all art of the deal. People on the left are all, there's something conspiracy. And both sides try to find a silver bullet when their side's out of power. And when they're in power, they get highly, highly defensive. The people on the left who were all that, Joe Biden, it's not senility. He's got a speech impediment. I mean, it's the same energy. It's actually the art of the deal. Same energy. Both sides engaging in some level of apologetics to defend their side, particularly when they get on the defensive. Listen, I was an elected Republican. I've given Donald Trump a lot of money. I supported him. I've had his family members on my radio show, but I strongly believe, and have ever since I got into politics, that you got to have people willing to, from inside the tent, disagree when you see something going badly. And I see tariffs going badly, and I'm willing to say so. And I'm sorry if that upsets some of you. I think it was David Asman, maybe it wasn't, with Will Cain, who was essentially saying, back in the 1950s, you could have one parent work, one parent stay at home. You had a nice middle class life. And nobody was super struggling, and now nobody can afford a house, cars, everything is out of reach for the middle class. That's a lot of nostalgia, and a lot of it is not based on the actual data. And if you actually do go back to the 1950s, what you often see are that they had a small house, maybe 2 or 3 bedrooms, the kids piled in multiple rooms together, sharing one bathroom. Maybe there were 2 bathrooms in the house. There was a 1-car garage. The parents shared the car. The dad did work. The mom did stay at home. They were pretty frugal. They didn't have a dishwasher because those weren't common then. Mom was the dishwasher. They might have had 1 TV in the house, not a bunch of TVs. They didn't have cable TV. They had 3 channels, maybe 4 over the air. They didn't go to Disney World because it didn't exist. They didn't travel. They went to a lake somewhere. They went camping for a vacation. They didn't take big vacations. There certainly was no internet. There was no cell phones. And you didn't make a lot of long-distance phone calls. If you did, you kept a timer so you weren't on too long because it cost an arm and a leg. And also, if you were black, you had very few of those things. This nostalgia for the 1950s, it's all well and good for white people to talk about, but you don't really want to talk to a black citizen of this United States about going back to the 1950s. You just don't. And if you don't understand why, you hadn't been paying attention. But also, a lot of the nostalgia isn't data-driven. I send my kids, or I did until one went to college, my son goes to a small Christian school, and there are multiple parents there who have working-class lives with one parent staying home, and they struggle to make ends meet, but they do it. They don't drive new cars. They drive used cars. They don't live in big houses. They live in small houses. They don't take fancy vacations, and they make it work. And they sacrifice. They keep their family together. And if anything, they're actually happier than a lot of the wealthier families I know. Their family life is more stable. They're in church together. Church is part of their community. People in church help each other out. We have a lot of people these days who talk a good game about you going to church and you got to be in church. You got to be involved in. They're living their lives as a secular atheist. They talk a good game. But we have this idea now that you get married and you need the $300,000 starter home with the 2-car garage and 2 cars and TVs in every room and the golf simulator out back and things like that. And a lot of it, we have set our expectations so high. And when you actually look at how people lived in the 1950s, we're exaggerating how they lived. Now, it is certainly true there are parts of the country where even the entry market for homes is unaffordable for people. There is. And, a lot of that is local government regulation. And unfortunately, it is true that the tariffs drive up the cost. Tariffs drive up the cost of steel and aluminum. Tariffs drive up the cost of the lumber. Tariffs drive up the cost of the sheetrock. Tariffs drive up the cost of the asphalt roofing, the shingles. Tariffs drive up the cost of the piping inside the house. Tariffs are actually going to make it more expensive to build a house and drive up the cost of houses. It's one of my frustrations with, I understand we're trying to fix this problem, but in trying to fix it, we're actually driving up the costs on the people who need costs to come down. But this massive fixation on the nostalgia of the 1950s and 60s, it reminds me of the Screwtape Letters. C.S. Lewis wrote the Screwtape Letters. If you're not familiar with them, they're very, very good. The Screwtape Letters, they're called Screwtape Letters because Screwtape is a demon. And he's writing a letter to an apprentice demon named Wormwood, giving Wormwood advice on dragging a man to hell. And when Screwtape refers to the enemy, he's referring to God Almighty himself. Just listen to this from Screwtape Letters. My dear Wormwood, I had noticed, of course, that the humans were having a lull in their European war, what they naively call the war. The Screwtape Letters was written during World War II. I am surprised that there is a corresponding lull in the patient's anxieties. Do we want to encourage this or keep him worried? Tortured fear and stupid confidence are both desirable states of mind. Our choice between them raises important questions. The humans live in time, but our enemy destines them for eternity. He, therefore, I believe, wants them to attend chiefly to two things, to eternity itself and to that point in time which they call the present. For the present is the point at which time touches eternity. Of the present moment and of it only, humans have an experience analogous to the experience which our enemy has of reality as a whole. In it alone, freedom and actuality are offered them. He would therefore have them continually concerned either with eternity, which means being concerned with him, or with the present, either meditating on their eternal union with or separation from him, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks for the present pleasure. Our business is to get humans away from the eternal and from the present. With this in view, we sometimes tempt a human, say a widow or a scholar, to live in the past. But this is of limited value, for they have some real knowledge of the past, and it has a determinate nature, and to that extent resembles eternity. It is far better to make them live in the future. Biological necessity makes all their passions point in that direction already, so that thought about the future inflames hope and fear. Also, it is unknown to them, so that in making them think about the future, we make them think of unrealities. In a word, the future is, of all things, the least like eternity. It is the most completely temporal part of time, for the past is frozen and no longer flows, and the present is all lit up with eternal rays. Hence the encouragement we have given to all those schemes of thought, such as creative evolution, scientific humanism, or communism, which fix men's affections on the future, on the very core of temporality. Hence, nearly all vices are rooted in the future. Gratitude looks to the past and love to the present. Fear, avarice, lust, and ambition look ahead. Do not think lust an exception. When the present pleasure arrives, the sin, which alone interests us, is already over. The pleasure is just the part of the process which we regret and would exclude if we could do so without losing the sin. It is the part contributed by the enemy and therefore experienced in the present. The sin, which is our contribution, looks forward. To be sure, the enemy wants men to think of the future too, just so much as it is necessary for now planning the acts of justice or charity, which will probably be their duty tomorrow. The duty of planning the morrow's work is today's duty. Though its material is borrowed from the future, the duty, like all duties, is in the present. This is not straw splitting. He does not want men to give the future their hearts, to place their treasure in it. We do. His ideal is a man who, having worked all day for the good of posterity, washes his mind of the whole subject, commits the issue to heaven, and returns at once to the patience or gratitude demanded by the moment that is passing over him. But we want a man hag-ridden by the future, haunted by the visions of an imminent heaven or hell upon earth, ready to break the enemy's commands in the present, if by so doing we make him think he can attain the one or avert the other, dependent for his faith on the success or failures of schemes whose end he will not live to see. We want a whole race perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end, never honest nor kind nor happy now, but always using as mere fuel wherewith to heap the altar of the future every real gift offered them in the present. What does all this mean? What is Screwtape saying? Keep people looking to the future, and often, he points out, it's very helpful to give people a nostalgia of the past that they wish to bring into the future. And when you have a nostalgia of the past, often that's what you have is not the real past. You have the happy memories of the past that over time have evolved into your head to something more than they were. My parents, for example, they live in my grandparents' house now. When I was a kid, we would go to my grandparents for events, and you'd have people piled into the kitchen and people piled into the dining room, and maybe the kids had stools and another table set up, a portable table, a card table, or we'd sit on the front porch and we'd have all these great family gatherings. Now that I'm an adult, I go in there and I'm like, my gosh, I never realized how small this house was. But I got the happy memories of the past sitting in there with my grandmother's siblings who would come, family reunions, things like that. But the house was actually way smaller. I mean, it's not like the house has shrunk. It's just I've gotten big, but I remember it being such a big house when I was small. And we think of those things and we think of those happy times and we forget. We forget that the amenities we have now didn't exist back in the 1950s, but we want to take the 1950s and turn it into some ideal that we're going to have for everybody. And we want this. We don't necessarily have a clean view of what it was. The nostalgia corrupts us and makes us not appreciate the present. There are certainly problems. Housing prices are nuts right now. The cost of living can be very high. Salaries, depending on what you do, not necessarily great right now. But you know what? The idea that you could go from high school into a 3-bedroom house with a car and a chicken in every pot in the 1950s is just as absurd as it is today. But people live on the nostalgia of it. They live on the past and they create an idol of the past to be imposed on the future. And they're actually future forward. They're looking at the future and they want to take from the past to give to the future. And they're just not paying attention to the present and how good we actually have it in the present. There are certainly problems in the present. There are certainly high costs in the present. But in the present, the here and now where we have it, you actually have a lot of good. It's where you actually live. You live in the present. You don't live in the future. You don't live in the past. And trying to take the past and impose it on the future is a fool's errand. There are certainly ways to improve our lives. It's one of the downsides of the tariffs, frankly, is they drive up the costs of the present and don't necessarily guarantee the future they claim. So don't get so wrapped up in the nostalgia for a past you've idealized in your head and that you wish to bring into the future that you neglect the present moment where your blessings are actually found. A number of people send me notes on social media and say, can you talk about martial law that's going into effect, or can you tell people martial law is not going into effect? I had no idea. I had to look. Martial law, what? What is going on out there? Well. It turns out the left-wing paranoia is really setting in to the extent that they believe on April 20th, martial law will be imposed on the country. You know what? That reminds me, I got to do my taxes. April 15th is coming up. Extension time. Yeah, April 20th, the world comes to an end. Martial law is imposed. Donald Trump declares himself essentially the autocrat, the emperor. Donald Trump will officially be an authoritarian on April 20th when martial law, and by the way, some people are spelling it marital law. I assure you Donald Trump is not imposing marital law on the country. But martial law, it comes April 20th, according to the left. See, here's what happened. On his first day in office, January 20th, Donald John Trump, President of the United States of America, signed an executive order that says on April 20th, the Department of Homeland Security and others have to certify the border is secure, or else extreme measures will be taken under the Insurrection Act. Therefore, if they don't say the border is secured, and they're not going to, because by not doing so, they're going to give the President of the United States martial law, and he will begin to round up his political opponents, and he will round them up and throw them in, well, probably the FEMA camps. This is so wild. So you go back to the Obama administration, and there were a lot of people on the right who offered this conspiracy theory about the FEMA camps. There are people who just want to believe the wacky conspiracy theories. And by the way, you should know that when I ridicule the idiots who believed in the FEMA camps, I get some highly angry emails and social media tweets and things at me and comments about how they were real. Oh, really? Did you wind up at the FEMA camp? No. But I know so-and-so who knows so-and-so who was married to so-and-so, who's kin to so-and-so, who delivered mail to someone else. And that person says they know someone who got wound up and put in a FEMA camp. It's real. Like Bigfoot. And now the left is doing it. It's going to be martial law in the United States of America. Donald Trump will round up his opponents and all of the they, thems, and theirs and put them in a FEMA camp. And he will re-educate them and make the they, them singular possessive pronouns. Really? This is where we are as a nation. Both sides, when the other side is in power, come up with the most extreme conspiracy theories. And it's not both sides. It's a fringe. And the problem here is this. When the right does FEMA camps, there are plenty of people on the right to tell them they've lost their mind. And you've got the entirety of the mainstream media telling them they've lost their mind. But when the left comes up with crazy conspiracy theories, you've got very few people on the left willing to tell people on the left, no, you've gone nuts. And you have very few members of the media who are willing to tell them they've gone nuts. In fact, so often the conspiracy theories of the left become mainstream because so many members of the media believe them. It's only a matter of time before MSNBC starts warning people about the coming martial law in the country. I would not be, well, I don't know. Joy Reid's gotten canceled now, so maybe not. But I wouldn't be surprised if some MSNBC show host starts talking about martial law coming on April 20th. I wouldn't be surprised at all. The wild things these people concoct. The delusional ramblings of the MSNBC host that lives in an alternate reality. Not in the real world, but in some alternate place where everything is terrible when Donald Trump is president. Everything is glorious and wonderful when Democrats are in charge. Friends, martial law is not going to happen on April 20th. How do you know, Erickson? How do you know? Well, because there are so many federal judges left and right who would be vehemently opposed to the idea of the president having the power under the Constitution of the United States to impose martial law. Why? Here's a dirty little secret. Shh. Come close. We don't want other people to know this. Shh. Listen carefully. Listen. I don't know if you know this or not. The police power is part of the state powers under the Constitution, not the federal power. It's why the Federal Bureau of Investigation is a Bureau of Investigation and not a police department, because the police power of the United States resides with the states. So if the president wants to declare martial law, good luck, sir, trying to declare martial law. But Lincoln, the Civil War, a lot of that stuff was undone by the United States Supreme Court, you will recall. Even Abraham Lincoln was constrained by the United States Supreme Court despite having the plenary war power of the United States, making Abraham Lincoln the most powerful president other than Franklin Roosevelt when declaring war. You know, the presidency can be an unbridled dictator when war is declared with certain limits. The war power gives the president extreme power, which is why Congress is always so reluctant to declare war. Congress hasn't declared war since World War II. They've been given the president resolutions, defense resolutions, without actually declaring war. Even after 9/11, Congress did not want to declare war because of the unbridled power of the presidency, which comes. And there's been no declaration of war by Congress, so the presidency cannot unleash those powers. All you have to do is understand the basic structure of the United States government. The Constitution of the United States creates a federal government that gives limited powers to Washington, D.C. Limited powers. Those limited powers are derived to allow the United States to act in harmony and otherwise to allow the United States to operate with one voice abroad. Now, here is the thing. There is the writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus essentially requires a hearing to justify someone's arrest. Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution says, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Martial law has been limited drastically in the United States. Comitatus rule, Posse Comitatus Act passed by Congress after the Civil War, which does not allow the military to operate as domestic law enforcement unless Congress specifically approves it on a case-by-case basis. Martial law, I'm just looking this up, martial law has been imposed 68 times in limited, usually local areas of the United States. Twice for war or invasion, 7 times for domestic war or insurrection, 11 times for riot or civil unrest, 29 times for labor disputes, 4 times for natural disaster, and 15 times for other reasons. Habeas corpus was suspended only once during the U.S. Civil War. It takes an act of Congress to suspend it. In most of those cases, if not all of those cases, it was the states that did it. The president and Congress are greatly restrained in how they can do it. Governors themselves actually have power to impose martial law. All you need to do is understand history and the law of the Constitution. And that's not really hard. You can open a book, you can read the Wikipedia entry. I mean, let me read this to you. In the United States, martial law has been used in a limited number of circumstances, such as New Orleans during the Battle of New Orleans, after major disasters such as the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, or during riots such as the Omaha Race Riot of 1919 or the 1920 Lexington Riot. Local leaders declared martial law to protect themselves from mob violence, such as the Nauvoo, Illinois during the Illinois Mormon War, or Utah during the Utah War, or in response to chaos associated with protests and rioting, such as the 1934 West Coast waterfront strike, in Hawaii after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, or during the Civil Rights Movement in response to the Cambridge Riot of 1963. The common thread is that martial law is most often suspended at the state level by local officials, not by Congress, because on a national level, the president and Congress have the power within certain constraints to impose martial law, since both can be in charge of the militia. However, the president's power is greatly restrained because of the habeas corpus rule, which can only be suspended by Congress. But the left doesn't care because they've internalized that Donald Trump is the big bad. And their talking heads and their leaders and their media outlets treat him as if he's some sort of authoritarian tyrant. But here's the thing. When we get to April 20th and martial law is not imposed, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he'll try, and then you'll find some federal court judge who enjoins him nationally and prevents it from happening. But let's just say, we get to April 20th and it doesn't happen. Hypothetically, it doesn't happen. Guess what? None of these people are going to have any level of awareness that they were played. We see this happen all the time. That when one side is in power, the other side kind of gets a little crazy, begins to lose its mind, begins to dabble in conspiracy theory, and becomes convinced of FEMA camps or martial law, and they refuse to be talked out of it. And in fact, so often, when you do point out it did not happen, someone's, no, it actually did happen. You may not be aware of it, but it actually did happen, like the FEMA camps. The number of people who will tell you they really were a thing. No accountability. No sense of restraint. Just crazy. It is a sign of a troubled mind when you will impute that much evil and violence on the other side politically. That's not to say there aren't people who don't engage in evil. There are. We're all sinners. We all fall short. We all have evil in our heart. But so oftentimes, the most political among us, the people who treat politics as a religion, the people who've turned it into an idol, they believe that the other side is evil. And it's people on the left believe people on the right are evil. People on the right believe people on the left are evil. And they impute to the leadership of either side the most sinister motives. And when what they believe is going to happen doesn't happen, they can't just walk it back and say I was wrong, and they can't recalibrate and think maybe they're not as bad as possible. They're just, oh, just wait, it's coming. And they will work themselves into a frenzy for 4 years, regardless of who's in charge. And these are the crazy people we should all be praying for and also avoid. There will be no martial law on April 12th. I'm old enough and I've been in this long enough to know that if I utter any criticism whatsoever of Donald Trump because I supported him twice and gave him a lot of money, but I didn't in 2016, therefore I must have Trump derangement syndrome. But my ultimate overarching point on this is I think someone from inside the tent, inside the Republican Party, needs to say bad idea. Because I do not want the Democrats to come back to power. I want the Democrats to wander in the wilderness as long as they possibly can. There's no such thing as a political majority that is permanent in this country. They'll eventually get there. The longer it takes, the better for them to purge the wokeism from them. And so I think tariffs are going to be blamed for hurting the economy. I think tariffs are going to put us into a recession because I know the history of tariffs in this country. I have actually studied that history. I'm not just some social media expert. I actually have a degree in history and political science, and I've worked with a lot of businesses over the years. I understand how tariffs affect them from my days as a corporate lawyer. I completely understand it. I see where this is headed, and I know what the American people will do. Right now, they say they hate the Democrats more than anything. If they get mad about the economy and their 401k, they'll put the Democrats back in power. I do not want that to happen. I think they will block Donald Trump's agenda, and with the exception of tariffs, I generally agree with his agenda. So I want him to stay and be unobstructed. And writing off the House of Representatives right now saying the Democrats are going to come back no matter what, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's going to be worse, and now you could cost yourself the Senate. And we can't afford to have woke Democrats back in power, which is why I think tariffs are a terrible idea, because it makes it more likely that the Democrats will come back into power. So I think we should get rid of all the tariffs, deregulate, cut taxes, fire up the American economy. And then the public will remember, oh, yeah, we really do hate the Democrats. And look, Donald Trump really did fix the economy. And the Republicans won't lose the House, and maybe they'll make some more gains in the Senate, and we'll all be safe from the progressive wokes dominating the Democratic Party. We simply should not be doing anything that makes it more likely for the Democrats to take control. And imposing tariffs increases the odds of a recession, which dramatically increases the chance that the American public goes, I know I hate him, but somebody's got to do something about Donald Trump. I don't want anybody to do anything about Donald Trump. I want him to engage. He's not going to be able to when his cabinet is constantly hauled up to Capitol Hill to answer the questions of woke Democrats who suddenly find themselves back in charge after only wandering the wilderness for 2 years, thereby concluding that actually the public loves them when the public does no such thing. Exactly who has started the constitutional crisis we've been hearing about? Lots of talk about constitutional crisis, Donald Trump provoking a constitutional crisis. Except he's now 7 out of 8 before the United States Supreme Court in wins. The only one that he's been held up on is birthright citizenship. Firing probationary workers, he's winning. Deporting gang members, he's winning. Not spending money, he's winning. Time and time again, the things that Donald Trump is doing, he gets to appellate courts or the Supreme Court, and he's winning. So maybe the constitutional crisis isn't actually Donald Trump. Maybe the constitutional crisis is progressive judges appointed by Democrats trying to obstruct the lawful powers of the President of the United States. After all, it's Constitution 101. The executive power resides in the president, not in an executive branch of government, but in the president. And if the president wants to rearrange the executive branch, fire its workers, or when Congress gives him money and says, spend it how you want, and he decides not to spend it, turns out the Supreme Court seems to think all of that is okay. It's the people screaming constitutional crisis who think it's wrong. Maybe they're the ones responsible for the constitutional crisis and not Donald Trump.